Under the dim shadow of American history lies a story so chilling, so quietly sinister, that even today it echoes as a haunting reminder of how far human deception can stretch when cloaked in the name of science. The year is 1932. The world is reeling from the Great Depression, families are torn apart by hunger, and in a small Alabama town, a group of men, ordinary farmers, sharecroppers, fathers, and sons, step forward to accept what they are told is a gift: free medical care. What they do not know is that their trusters mark them for one of the darkest chapters in medical history. It is here, in Tuskegee, that the seeds of deception are planted, and for 40 long years they will grow in silence, watered by lies and fertilized by the cold detachment of government scientists. This is not a story of war crimes in a distant land, nor atrocities committed under foreign regimes. This is America's secret, an experiment carried out not in the hidden dungeons of a dictatorship but in the daylight of a democratic nation. The victims are not prisoners of war, but citizens, exploited because of their race, their poverty, and their lack of power. It is this disturbing truth that sets Tuskegee apart, a calculated choice to treat human beings as disposable subjects in the pursuit of knowledge. The experiment was not hidden behind barbed wire. It was hidden behind promises of medical help, treatment, and care that never came. Imagine being told by men in white coats that you suffer from bad blood, a phrase vague enough to inspire fear yet simple enough to seem believable. Imagine being assured that with regular checkups, free meals, and medicines, you will be healed. But the reality is that nothing being given to you is meant to cure. Instead, every appointment, every test, every injection is a performance, part of a larger script written to watch how your illness will slowly destroy you. You are not a patient. You are data. And your suffering is not a tragedy to those observing. It is a measurement. The horror of Tuskegee does not rest solely on the suffering of the men involved, but in the careful, deliberate web of deception. Scientists and officials did not stumble into error. They chose silence. They chose to watch, not act. They chose to let men die in agony, even as a cure became available. And for decades, the outside world had no idea. While families mourned in small Alabama homes, researchers built careers, published papers, and claimed authority. The language of medicine became a mask that concealed something far more sinister, a violation of the most basic trust between healer and patient. For the people of Macon County, these men were not faceless subjects. They were fathers who worked the fields, husbands who dreamed of providing for their families, sons who carried the weight of their communities. Their lives were as ordinary as any, yet they were stripped of dignity in the name of progress. Each man who sat in the doctor's office, rolled up his sleeve, and placed his life into the hands of professionals, did so with faith, a faith that was betrayed with every passing year of silence. Why does this matter now? Because the Tuskegee experiment is not just a relic of the past. It is a mirror held up to society's darkest impulses. It asks uncomfortable questions. How far will institutions go when they believe the ends justify the means? Who is deemed expendable in the name of science? And perhaps most haunting of all, could it happen again, hidden beneath the promises of progress and the veil of authority? These questions linger because Tuskegee was not an isolated mistake. It was the product of a system that valued power and knowledge over human life. As we peel back the layers of this story, we are forced to confront not only the actions of individuals but the complicity of an entire structure. Government agencies, doctors, and universities all played their part. Silence from those who knew better was as lethal as the disease itself. The Tuskegee experiment becomes, therefore, not just a story of suffering, but a story of betrayal. Betrayal by a nation that claimed liberty and justice while secretly sacrificing its most vulnerable citizens. This documentary will take you through the world of 1932, into the lives of the men who trusted too much, and through the corridors of power where decisions were made that would doom them. We will explore how medical science, once a promise of hope, became a weapon of deception. And as the narrative unfolds, it will not only recount the events but immerse you in the chilling reality of how easily truth can be twisted, how deeply trust can be broken, and how long it can take for the full weight of injustice to surface. This is not simply a story about syphilis or medical research. It is a story about deception, planned, executed, and maintained for 4 decades. It is a story about power unchecked, ethics ignored, and lives devalued. The men of Tuskegee did not volunteer to die for science. They were never given that choice. Instead, they were trapped in a study where their illness was their sentence, their pain was the experiment, and their deaths were the data. The curtain now begins to lift on what would later be called one of the most shameful chapters in American medical history. The year is 1932, and in Tuskegee, Alabama, the experiment has begun. America in 1932 was a nation suffocating under the crushing weight of the Great Depression. Unemployment rates soared to unprecedented levels, banks collapsed overnight, and entire families found themselves wandering the roads in search of work or food. Cities were filled with breadlines, and rural towns, especially in the South, were drowning in poverty. Against this backdrop of desperation, Tuskegee, Alabama, sat quietly in Macon County, a predominantly black community where most men worked the soil as sharecroppers, barely surviving on meager harvests and unfair contracts. For them, life was already a daily struggle against hunger, illness, and systemic oppression. It was within this fragile setting that the stage was set for one of the most sinister experiments in American history. Segregation defined every corner of Southern life. Jim Crow laws divided schools, neighborhoods, hospitals, even water fountains. Black men and women were treated as second-class citizens, their voices silenced by laws designed to uphold white supremacy. In healthcare, the inequality was even starker. Access to medical treatment was scarce, and the few facilities available to black citizens were underfunded and understaffed. Illness spread easily in communities with little to no sanitation infrastructure, and the very idea of receiving consistent medical care felt like a luxury few could dream of. The perfect breeding ground for exploitation was already in place: poverty, racial disenfranchisement, and desperation. Within Macon County, syphilis was rampant. The disease, devastating in its progression, was poorly understood by most rural citizens. Symptoms could remain hidden for years before suddenly erupting into neurological collapse, blindness, or death. Many locals attributed illness to vague concepts like bad blood, a catch-all term used to describe fatigue, anemia, or any number of chronic conditions. This lack of medical understanding made the community vulnerable to authority figures who claimed to have answers. When government doctors arrived offering free healthcare, men who had lived their entire lives without reliable treatment saw it as nothing short of salvation. The Federal Public Health Service was searching for a natural laboratory to study syphilis, and Macon County provided exactly that. Here was a population poor enough to accept any offer of help, isolated enough to remain under observation, and disenfranchised enough to prevent any meaningful resistance. The tragedy of Tuskegee was not born in a vacuum. It was made possible by the conditions of the era. Economic despair left men willing to trust anyone who promised food or medicine. Social hierarchies ensured their voices carried little weight, and systemic racism allowed officials to justify their exploitation under the guise of scientific advancement. At the same time, American medicine was undergoing a transformation. The early 20th century had seen major breakthroughs, but it had also witnessed shocking lapses in ethics. The obsession with progress often overshadowed concern for patients' rights. Medical schools conducted questionable experiments, and poor or minority communities were frequently treated as expendable. The Tuskegee study did not represent a sudden betrayal. It was the logical outcome of a system that placed knowledge above humanity. It revealed the darker side of a profession that, while promising healing, often rationalized cruelty in the name of discovery. In the broader cultural landscape, trust in government programs was uneven. For many black communities, the memory of slavery and ongoing oppression meant that authority figures were often viewed with suspicion. Yet at the same time, survival demanded compromise. When doctors from the Public Health Service appeared, they carried the authority of the state, the prestige of medical science, and the promise of aid that no one else was offering. For families barely able to feed themselves, the chance at free medical care, even if poorly understood, was worth seizing. The decision to participate was less about choice and more about necessity. Meanwhile, national conversations about race further reinforced the conditions that allowed Tuskegee to begin. In the 1930s, eugenics still influenced public policy and academic thought. Many scientists openly believed in racial hierarchies, arguing that black populations were biologically inferior. These beliefs gave cover to experiments that devalued black lives under the justification that they were serving a greater good. The men in Tuskegee were not viewed as individuals with families, hopes, and futures. They were framed as a collective problem to be studied, measured, and written about in medical journals. Within this atmosphere of despair, inequality, and flawed science, the Tuskegee experiment was born. In 1932, the Public Health Service initiated what was described to the community as a treatment program. In reality, it was a carefully constructed lie. Recruitment posters promised free medical exams, meals, and burial insurance. Doctors reassured men that their bad blood would be treated. And with trust born from desperation, Hundreds signed up. They did not know they were stepping into a role designed not to heal them but to let their disease progress unchecked for decades. The contrast between the suffering of these men and the ambitions of those who studied them could not have been starker. While families hoped for relief from relentless poverty and illness, government scientists saw only opportunity. Every cough, every fever, every death was data to be recorded. And the rural silence of Tuskegee ensured that few would ever hear the truth. In a nation obsessed with recovery from economic collapse, the plight of poor black farmers in Alabama was easily ignored. By understanding the social and political conditions of 1932, we see that the Tuskegee study was not a sudden aberration but a calculated exploitation of a vulnerable community. It grew from a soil of poverty, watered by racism, and sustained by the desperation of men who had nowhere else to turn. This was the world into which the experiment was born, a world where deception could flourish unchecked because the men of Tuskegee had little power to question, and even less power to resist. The setting was perfect for those who sought knowledge at any cost. The silence of the rural South, the weight of economic despair, and the grip of systemic racism all converged in Tuskegee. And as the experiment began, the men who believed they were receiving help could not know that they were stepping into a carefully laid trap, one that would span 40 years, claiming lives, spreading trauma, and leaving behind a legacy that still haunts America today. The origins of the Tuskegee syphilis study can be traced to a moment when science and prejudice intertwined, producing a project that would forever scar the history of American medicine. By 1932, the United States Public Health Service was desperate to understand syphilis in its most destructive form. Syphilis had plagued humanity for centuries, moving like a shadow through populations, destroying bodies and minds, leaving behind blindness, paralysis, dementia, and death. Yet despite its devastation, the disease carried with it a deep stigma, often tied to morality and sexuality. Treating syphilis was difficult, expensive, and often dangerous before the arrival of penicillin. For researchers eager to map the disease's natural course, what they needed was a population large enough, poor enough, and vulnerable enough to be observed over time. The idea was simple, though sinister. If a group of men could be studied from infection through death, scientists would gain invaluable knowledge about how syphilis progressed. But instead of finding volunteers who understood the risks, the Public Health Service designed an experiment rooted in deception. Tuskegee, Alabama, provided the perfect stage. This rural black community, crippled by poverty and plagued by disease, became the chosen ground for a project that would masquerade as medical aid but in reality was a death sentence disguised as care. The study's foundation was laid in partnership with the Tuskegee Institute, a historically black college that, at the time, lent credibility to the project. Local doctors, nurses, and leaders were recruited to help gain the community's trust. In particular, Nurse Eunice Rivers became a pivotal figure. A black nurse deeply respected in the community, she acted as a bridge between the men and the Public Health Service. Through her presence, participants felt reassured. She was, to them, a familiar face who seemed to advocate for their well-being. But her role, whether knowingly complicit or tragically misguided, became essential in keeping the men enrolled, year after year, generation after generation. Recruitment was carried out with calculated precision. Flyers promised free medical care for bad blood, a phrase so broad and familiar that many locals readily identified with it. Bad blood was a catch-all diagnosis used to explain everything from fatigue to anemia, and the men believed that by enrolling in the program, they would receive treatment. Instead, what they received were physical examinations, blood tests, spinal taps, procedures that carried the appearance of care but were never meant to heal. The men were not told they had syphilis. They were not informed that they were participants in a long-term study. They were told only what the government wanted them to believe, that they were patients being treated by skilled doctors. In reality, the doctors were not healers but observers. Their notes and charts recorded the progression of the disease as if the men's suffering were nothing more than an experiment in motion. The study enrolled 600 men, 399 of whom had syphilis, while 201 did not and served as controls. These men were poor sharecroppers, many unable to read or write, many unfamiliar with the language of medicine. Their vulnerability made them easy targets for deception. The promise of free meals, medical exams, and even burial insurance proved irresistible. For families living in the depths of the Depression, such offers were not luxuries, they were lifelines. The men did not realize they were stepping into a role that would rob them of health, dignity, and ultimately, life. Each blood test, each spinal tap, was presented as necessary treatment. In reality, These procedures were designed to gather data on how syphilis ravaged the body. Even more disturbing, the men were given sham treatments, tonics, aspirins, ointments, all presented as medicine, but none capable of curing their illness. The lie was elaborate and sustained, carefully nurtured by the very institutions sworn to protect health. Behind the project was a twisted justification. Officials believed they were conducting important science that could one day benefit humanity. The rationale was steeped not only in scientific ambition but also in the racist assumption that black bodies were suitable vessels for such a study. Many researchers of the time openly held the belief that black people were biologically different, that their suffering was somehow less significant, and that their bodies were ideal for observing disease without the ethical complications that might arise if white patients were involved. These views, rooted in eugenics and systemic racism, shaped the very foundation of the Tuskegee study. Documents from the early years reveal how deliberate the deception was. Memos discussed not whether the men should be informed, but how best to keep them in the dark. Officials knew exactly what they were doing. They referred to spinal taps, a painful procedure, as special free treatment to encourage compliance. They discussed strategies to maintain the illusion of care while ensuring the men never received anything that might cure them. The experiment was not a mistake or oversight. It was a calculated betrayal designed from the beginning. At the heart of this origin story lies the cold logic of scientific curiosity unchecked by ethics. The researchers wanted to watch syphilis unfold in real time, to track its damage across decades, to publish their findings in journals and conferences. And they did. Papers based on Tuskegee data appeared in prestigious medical journals throughout the 1930s and 1940s, lending credibility to the project and solidifying careers. Yet behind every statistic, every chart, and every conclusion was a man slowly losing his health, his mind, and his life, all without ever knowing he was a subject, not a patient. For the community of Tuskegee, the arrival of government doctors felt like hope. But that hope was an illusion carefully crafted to ensure cooperation. The study's origins, cloaked in promises of care, reveal the most disturbing element of all, the betrayal of trust. Trust between patient and doctor, between citizen and government, between human being and institution. By manipulating that trust, the Public Health Service secured decades of data, but at the cost of countless lives and generations of pain. The Tuskegee study did not begin as an accident, nor as a misunderstood project. It began with clear intentions, detailed planning, and a decision to deceive. In 1932, what was presented as a generous medical program was, in truth, the opening act of a 40-year tragedy. The origins lay not only in the ambition to study disease but in the willingness to exploit the powerless. And with that decision, the lives of 600 men and their families would be forever altered. The men of Tuskegee were not numbers on a chart, nor anonymous dots on a medical graph. They were husbands, fathers, sons, neighbors, men who worked the red Alabama soil with cracked hands and bent backs. They rose before dawn to tend fields that were not their own, harvesting cotton, corn, and peanuts for wages so small they could barely keep their families fed. Many were illiterate, not because they lacked intelligence, but because opportunity was denied to them. Their lives were defined by hard labor, meager pay, and the constant weight of racial segregation. And yet, like any other men, they dreamed of better days, cherished their children, and sought dignity in the face of adversity. When the Public Health Service came to Macon County, promising free medical care, the men saw it as a rare gift. Doctors rarely visited their community, and when they did, the costs were beyond reach. For men who had long accepted illness as part of life, the idea of government-backed treatment felt miraculous. They trusted these officials not only because they carried the authority of science, but because they seemed to offer kindness in a world that had given them little. Hope wrapped itself around deception, making the betrayal all the more devastating. The stories of these men reveal the human side of a study often remembered only in statistics. One farmer, a father of 6, enrolled after hearing that his bad blood would be treated. He endured constant fatigue and sores that would not heal, but he believed the doctors were helping him. Instead, they monitored his decline, recording every symptom as his condition worsened. Another man, younger and newly married, signed up for what he thought was preventative care. He dreamed of building a future with his wife, only to unknowingly pass the disease to her, condemning both their lives to tragedy. These personal narratives, repeated hundreds of times, underscore the cruelty of the experiment. Men who trusted, families who believed, futures destroyed by lies. In the community, the men became known as part of the study, though few fully understood what that meant. They would line up for checkups, blood tests, and procedures, reassured by Nurse Eunice Rivers, who smiled warmly and encouraged their compliance. She told them that doctors were there to help. She handed them aspirin and tonics, presented as treatments, and soothed their fears during painful spinal taps disguised as special medicine. To the men, she was a friend, perhaps even a guardian. To the study, she was an indispensable tool in maintaining trust. Through her presence, the illusion of care persisted, binding the men ever tighter to the experiment. What makes the tragedy more haunting is the deep trust the men placed in the medical profession. For generations, African Americans in the South had been excluded from quality health care. Hospitals often refused them, and black doctors were too few and underfunded to meet the need. Thus, when the government arrived, it carried an aura of authority that seemed untouchable. To challenge a doctor's word was unthinkable, especially when cloaked in the language of science. The men, accustomed to being dismissed and ignored in nearly every other aspect of life, believed they had finally been chosen for something good. That belief became their undoing. The experiment not only harmed the men but rippled through their families. Wives, unknowingly infected, bore children who inherited the disease. Sons grew up watching fathers weaken, unable to work the fields as they once had. Daughters saw mothers grow sick and families sink deeper into poverty. The men of Tuskegee did not suffer alone. Their pain became generational. The study turned entire households into unknowing participants, ensuring that the legacy of deception stretched far beyond the 600 men enrolled. Despite their suffering, the men were not silent victims. Oral histories reveal moments when participants questioned why their treatments never cured them, why their health continued to decline. But each time, their doubts were soothed by reassurances from doctors or Nurse Rivers. In a world where questioning authority often brought punishment, their voices could go no further. The men's suspicions were drowned in a sea of lies carefully maintained by those in power. As the years went on, the men became accustomed to the routine of examinations and checkups. It was a ritual woven into their lives. The bus rides to the clinics, the endless tests, the small tokens of compensation like free meals or funeral benefits. These gestures, though meager, reinforced the illusion that the government cared for them. In truth, these offerings were nothing more than bait, keeping the men tethered to a study that valued their disease more than their dignity. To fully understand the human dimension of Tuskegee, one must picture these men not as faceless victims but as individuals with hopes and burdens. Imagine a father coming home from a day of plowing fields, sitting at a table with his children, believing he was receiving care that might prolong his life. Imagine his wife watching him grow weaker, wondering why the treatments never seemed to work, but trusting the doctors who insisted everything was under control. Imagine a son watching his father decline, not realizing he would inherit not only his father's landlessness but also his father's disease. These scenes played out in countless homes, each a silent tragedy unfolding beneath the shadow of a false promise. The cruelty of Tuskegee lies in its intimacy. These were not strangers plucked from faraway lands but men rooted in a single community, known by name, seen in church, working the same soil as their neighbors. Their suffering was witnessed daily, yet explained away as the course of illness rather than the result of deliberate neglect. The study's architects did not merely exploit a population, they infiltrated the lives of men who had little to give but their trust. The men of Tuskegee stand today as symbols of betrayal, not because they were passive or naive, but because they were deliberately misled by a system designed to exploit their vulnerability. They remind us that injustice often hides not in overt cruelty but in the quiet manipulation of hope. Their names may not appear in history books, but their stories echo through every discussion of medical ethics, every cautionary tale of human experimentation. In remembering them, we acknowledge more than their suffering. We acknowledge their humanity, their labor, their families, their trust. They were not test subjects, they were men whose lives were stolen by deception. And as the experiment moved forward, their individual tragedies were buried under piles of data and scientific papers. But behind every statistic, every line in a medical journal, there was a man who once believed he was being healed. That truth makes the Tuskegee study not only a scientific scandal but a human one, carved into the lives of men who simply wanted care, and instead found betrayal. Medical deception sits at the very heart of the Tuskegee syphilis study. What makes this experiment not only infamous but uniquely horrifying is the way in which treatment was not simply denied, it was actively replaced with lies. From the very beginning, the men were told they were being cared for, that their mysterious illness known locally as bad blood was being treated by skilled professionals. Yet every appointment, every pill, every injection was an illusion. The reality was cruelly simple. They were never meant to be cured. Their role was to suffer, to deteriorate, and ultimately to die, all while believing they were under the protection of medical science. Syphilis, left untreated, is one of the most destructive diseases known to medicine. After the initial infection, the bacteria could hide in the body for years, slowly attacking the nervous system, the heart, and other organs. Victims endured a range of agonizing symptoms: ulcers, blindness, paralysis, dementia, even psychosis. Death, when it came, was often the end of a long, painful decline. For the men of Tuskegee, this grim future was guaranteed, not by chance, but by design. The very people who had sworn to heal them were ensuring that the disease ran its full course, unchecked, in order to satisfy scientific curiosity. To maintain the illusion of treatment, the Public Health Service employed a series of deceptive tactics. One of the most insidious was the language used. Men were told they had bad blood, a term deliberately chosen because it was vague enough to be understood by the local population but imprecise enough to conceal the truth. To these men, bad blood could mean anything: anemia, fatigue, or syphilis itself. By using this phrase, doctors avoided revealing the diagnosis, stripping the men of their right to informed consent. They could not consent to an experiment they didn't know they were part of. Even the procedures performed were wrapped in lies. The spinal tap, a painful, invasive process in which a needle is inserted into the spinal column, was described to participants as special free treatment. Imagine being told that this agonizing procedure was a gift, something designed to help, when in reality it was performed only to gather data on the spread of the disease to the nervous system. Men left clinics sore, fearful, yet reassured that what they endured was part of their healing. In truth, it was nothing more than a step in documenting their decline. The deception extended to the so-called medicines provided. Men received pills, tonics, and ointments, many of which were nothing more than aspirin or ineffective placebos. These were distributed with the same authority and confidence as real treatment, giving the impression of care. To poor farmers with no medical knowledge, the appearance of medicine was enough. They took the pills faithfully, believing each dose brought them closer to recovery. All the while, the disease progressed unchecked, burrowing deeper into their bodies as the years stretched into decades. What makes the deception even more grotesque is the timing. By the 1940s, a genuine cure for syphilis had been discovered. Penicillin, proven effective and widely recognized as the treatment of choice, became available in the United States. For most Americans, this breakthrough marked the end of syphilis as a death sentence. Yet for the men of Tuskegee, the cure was deliberately withheld. The Public Health Service went so far as to coordinate with local draft boards and physicians to ensure participants could not access penicillin elsewhere. Letters were sent warning doctors not to treat the men, keeping them tethered to the experiment. In the name of science, officials actively blocked life-saving treatment, ensuring that death remained inevitable. The cruelty of withholding penicillin cannot be overstated. Imagine living in constant pain, watching your body betray you, and knowing that somewhere out there was a cure, but it was being denied because someone in power decided your suffering was more valuable than your survival. This was not negligence. It was not oversight. It was a deliberate decision, reaffirmed again and again as the decades passed. The men of Tuskegee were not forgotten by accident. They were held in place by calculated deception. The methods of deception were reinforced by trusted figures within the community. Nurse Eunice Rivers, who served as the constant presence in the study, became central in maintaining trust. She visited homes, reassured families, and persuaded reluctant men to continue participating. When they grew suspicious, she calmed their doubts. Her role blurred the line between caregiver and accomplice. For the men, she was a familiar face, someone who spoke their language and offered comfort. But her presence also allowed the study to continue unchecked, because through her, the illusion of care was never broken. Perhaps most chilling of all were the autopsies. Men were promised burial insurance if they stayed in the study, a small but meaningful comfort for families who feared the costs of funerals. In exchange, officials secured permission to examine the men's bodies after death. Even in their final moments, the men of Tuskegee were treated as data points. Their deaths were not mourned by the researchers. They were opportunities for measurement, another layer of information in the pursuit of knowledge. The promise of dignity in burial became just another deception, one final betrayal after a lifetime of lies. The Tuskegee study revealed not only the cruelty of medical deception but the cold efficiency with which it was carried out. Every aspect of the men's experience was engineered to reinforce trust while ensuring ignorance. Language, procedures, medicine, and community figures all played roles in sustaining the illusion. This was not chaos, It was design. And the longer it continued, the more it revealed the chilling priorities of those in power, that the suffering of hundreds of men, and the collateral damage to their families, was acceptable if it produced scientific data. The legacy of this deception is staggering. It demonstrated how fragile trust can be when placed in institutions that value discovery over humanity. It showed that the power imbalance between doctor and patient can be weaponized, turning care into exploitation. And it underscored a truth that still resonates today, that when marginalized communities are denied transparency and dignity, they are left vulnerable to abuses that masquerade as progress. For the men of Tuskegee, the reality was simple yet devastating. They believed they were patients. They were, in fact, subjects. They believed they were being healed. They were, in fact, being studied as their health collapsed. They believed the government had come to help. The government had come to deceive. And as the decades passed, the disease claimed their bodies while the lie claimed their trust, leaving behind a legacy of pain that cannot be measured in charts or data, but only in the broken lives it left behind. The Tuskegee syphilis study was built on more than lies and broken promises. It was also fueled by the cold pursuit of science. To understand why the Public Health Service justified decades of deception, one must first understand the scientific obsession with syphilis itself. In the early 20th century, syphilis was one of the most feared diseases in the world. It was called the Great Imitator because its symptoms mimicked so many other conditions. It could cause rashes, fevers, ulcers, or neurological collapse. Left untreated, it attacked the nervous system and vital organs, leading to paralysis, blindness, dementia, and death. Its unpredictable course fascinated researchers who sought to map every stage of the disease in painstaking detail. For physicians in the 1930s, there was a problem. Treatments for syphilis were limited, expensive, and often dangerous. Before penicillin, the main therapies were arsenic-based drugs like salvarsan, or painful mercury rubs. These treatments were toxic, required multiple sessions, and often did more harm than good. Many patients abandoned them halfway through, leaving doctors frustrated by incomplete cases. What researchers wanted was an unbroken picture of syphilis in its natural form, a group of patients who would never receive treatment, whose bodies could reveal the disease from beginning to end. Tuskegee, with its impoverished and marginalized population, became the laboratory they were searching for. The science behind the study was framed in cold, clinical terms. Researchers divided the men into two groups, 399 with syphilis and 201 without, who would serve as controls. They meticulously recorded blood samples, physical exams, and medical histories. Each symptom was catalogued: ulcers on the skin, neurological tremors, heart murmurs, gradual blindness. To the men, these visits felt like treatment. To the scientists, they were data points on a graph, proof of how syphilis eroded the human body over time. The progression of the disease, normally hidden by sporadic medical interventions, unfolded in real time before their eyes. The stages of syphilis became the study's grim roadmap. In the primary stage, sores known as chancres appeared at the site of infection. In the secondary stage, rashes covered the body, sometimes accompanied by fever, sore throat, and fatigue. These symptoms might vanish, lulling patients into a false sense of recovery. But syphilis was only retreating deeper, entering its latent stage, when no outward symptoms appeared but internal damage continued silently. Finally, years or even decades later, came tertiary syphilis, the most destructive phase. It ravaged the brain, the heart, and the nervous system, causing insanity, strokes, organ failure, and death. For the researchers in Tuskegee, every phase was an opportunity to observe. For the men, it was a death sentence disguised as care. Medical journals at the time praised the study for its scale and longevity. Researchers published findings that detailed how syphilis manifested differently in the black population, perpetuating racist assumptions about biology. Many scientists argued, without evidence, that black men were more likely to suffer from cardiovascular complications, while white patients developed neurological symptoms. These theories were shaped not by objective data but by prejudice, reinforcing stereotypes that black bodies were biologically distinct and therefore expendable in the pursuit of science. Tuskegee was not just a study of syphilis, it became a justification for racist medical theories. The arrival of penicillin in the 1940s should have ended the study. Penicillin was hailed as a miracle drug, curing syphilis quickly and safely. But the Public Health Service saw this breakthrough not as a solution, but as a threat. If the men were cured, the study's decades-long dataset would be ruined. Instead of providing treatment, Officials doubled down on their deception. They actively worked to prevent the men from accessing penicillin. Notices were sent to local doctors, instructing them not to treat participants. Military draft boards, which routinely screened men for syphilis, were informed to exclude the Tuskegee subjects from receiving care. The cure existed, but for these men, it was locked away by the very people they trusted most. What makes the scientific side of Tuskegee so chilling is the utter detachment of those involved. Reports and memos show little concern for the men's suffering. The language is clinical, almost sterile, as if the participants were not human beings but specimens in a lab. Their pain was reduced to numbers, their deaths to data. The researchers' careers thrived on the results. Papers were presented at conferences, findings were published in respected journals, and reputations were built, all on the backs of men who were never told the truth. Behind every chart and statistic was a human life unraveling. One man might have lost his vision, stumbling blindly through his home while his children watched helplessly. Another may have been confined to bed by strokes or paralysis, unable to work the fields that once fed his family. Another, in the grip of neurosyphilis, could have descended into madness, his personality and memory stripped away. To the scientists, these tragedies were case studies. To the families, they were unbearable losses compounded by confusion. Why had the treatments not worked? Why did the doctor's visits bring no relief? The answer, hidden from them, was that they had never been treated at all. The cold pursuit of knowledge in Tuskegee raises a haunting question. How far should science go in its quest for answers? The justification offered by researchers was that the study would benefit future generations, that the suffering of these men would yield knowledge to save countless others. But such reasoning collapses under the weight of the reality. The knowledge gained was not worth the human cost. Worse, it was built on a foundation of lies and racial exploitation, ensuring that even the scientific data itself was tainted by bias and cruelty. The Tuskegee study ultimately demonstrated not the power of science, but the danger of science without ethics. It showed how curiosity, when stripped of morality, becomes monstrous. It revealed how institutions can rationalize cruelty in the name of progress, and how racism can infiltrate even the most respected fields, warping medicine into a tool of oppression. The science behind Tuskegee was not neutral. It was shaped by prejudice, driven by ambition, and sustained by deception. As we peel back the layers of this study, the chilling truth emerges. The men were never patients. They were subjects, reduced to bodies that carried disease, their humanity erased in pursuit of data. The researchers watched syphilis ravage them with the same detachment a naturalist might observe an animal in the wild. But these were not animals. They were men with families, men with dignity, men who believed in promises that were never meant to be kept. The science of Tuskegee was not a triumph of knowledge, but a betrayal of trust, a reminder that without ethics, science can become as destructive as the diseases it seeks to cure. In the early years of the Tuskegee syphilis study, silence reigned. Government officials, public health doctors, and researchers involved in the project maintained a united front, presenting the study as a legitimate medical effort. Yet behind the curtain of compliance, there were whispers, voices of dissent that questioned not only the ethics but the very humanity of what was being done. These were not loud protests broadcast to the nation. They were murmurs, letters, conversations, and subtle objections from individuals who recognized the cruelty unfolding. Their warnings, however, were ignored, suppressed, or rationalized away by a system determined to preserve the study at all costs. These concerns, however, were dismissed. The rationale given was that ending the study would ruin decades of carefully collected data. Careers, reputations, and the integrity of the research were placed above human lives. Each objection was deflected with the same cold justification. Science demanded sacrifice, and these men were the chosen sacrifices. Among the most persistent voices of dissent came from individuals like Dr. Erwin Schatz, a young physician who in the 1960s read about the study in a medical journal and was horrified by what he saw. Schatz wrote a letter to the authors, condemning the study and declaring it unethical to allow men to suffer untreated when penicillin was available. His letter was met with silence. No reply was ever sent, and the study continued. Schatz's lone protest is remembered today as a brave act of defiance, but at the time, it was brushed aside as if it never existed. This pattern of ignoring dissent was systemic. The study survived not because no one saw its flaws, but because those in power chose to silence or disregard the objections. The culture of the medical establishment was built around hierarchy and loyalty. Younger doctors or staff who questioned the ethics risked their careers. while those higher up were more invested in preserving the project than in confronting its immorality. Dissent was not only unwelcome, it was dangerous. As a result, many who might have spoken louder kept their concerns quiet, allowing the deception to endure. It is also important to understand how racism shaped the dismissal of dissenting voices. To many officials, the lives of the Tuskegee men did not carry the same weight as white patients. This belief made it easier to rationalize their suffering as an unfortunate but acceptable cost of scientific progress. When someone raised the question, "Shouldn't these men be treated?" the response was often framed in terms of practicality. Why waste limited resources on a group considered socially inferior? The underlying prejudice meant that dissent was not only ignored but actively undermined by the racial logic of the time. Outside of official channels, rumors sometimes spread within the community itself. Some participants began to suspect that they were not receiving real treatment. They questioned why their health never improved, why their wives and children also became sick. But in a society where challenging white authority could bring severe repercussions, these suspicions remained whispers within homes and churches. Nurse Eunice Rivers, with her trusted role, played a central part in quieting these doubts, reassuring the men that the doctors were doing what was best. Her reassurances effectively smothered the small sparks of dissent within the community, keeping the illusion intact. The tragedy of these silenced voices lies in the fact that the experiment could have ended decades earlier. If the early objections had been heeded, if the warnings had been amplified instead of ignored, countless lives could have been saved. Yet the bureaucracy of silence, the institutional machinery that prioritized reputation, funding, and racial bias over morality, ensured that the whispers never grew into shouts. By the time dissent finally broke through in the 1970s, generations had already suffered. The persistence of the Tuskegee study illustrates how powerful institutions can absorb and neutralize dissent. A letter of protest can vanish in a drawer. A concerned doctor can be dismissed as naive. A questioning nurse can be reassured into complicity. The machinery of deception is strongest not because no one resists, but because it knows how to silence resistance before it grows. Tuskegee is a chilling case study in how ethical concerns, when unheeded, become ghosts, haunting reminders of opportunities lost. In retrospect, the voices of dissent serve as moral anchors. They remind us that not everyone was blind to the cruelty, that even in a system built on deception, some individuals recognize the truth. Their protests, though ignored, stand today as proof that there were always choices. The government and medical establishment could have chosen to listen. They could have ended the study when penicillin became available. They could have treated the men honestly and humanely. Instead, they chose silence. And in that silence, the suffering continued. The whispers of dissent in the Tuskegee study echo across time as both warnings and indictments. They warn us that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. They indict a system that values data over dignity, careers over compassion, and reputation over responsibility. The men of Tuskegee were not only betrayed by those who deceived them, but also by those who recognized the wrong and allowed it to continue. In the long shadow of this experiment, we are left with the haunting truth. Dissent existed, but it was not enough to pierce the walls of deception. By the 1960s, America was changing. The civil rights movement was reshaping the nation, demanding justice, equality, and accountability from institutions that had long thrived on silence. Yet in Tuskegee, Alabama, the study that had begun in 1932 continued, hidden in plain sight. The men were still being examined, still deceived, still denied treatment, even as the outside world celebrated scientific progress and social change. But cracks were beginning to appear in the silence. These cracks, born of conscience, would eventually grow into the fissure that shattered the study forever. The first tremors came from within the medical establishment itself. In 1966, a young venereal disease investigator named Peter Buxton joined the U.S. Public Health Service. Buxton was tasked with handling complaints from patients about treatments for sexually transmitted diseases. As part of his job, he began reading internal reports and medical literature on ongoing research projects. It was there, buried among dry statistics and clinical jargon, that he stumbled upon references to the Tuskegee study. At first, he assumed it must have been an old project, a relic of a darker time. But as he dug deeper, the horrifying truth became clear. The study was not only ongoing, but officials intended to let it continue until every participant had died and autopsies could be performed. Shocked, Buxton raised his concerns with his superiors. He argued that withholding treatment was unethical, especially now that penicillin had been proven to cure syphilis quickly and effectively. His objections were met with indifference. Officials told him the study was too valuable to stop, that the data being gathered was irreplaceable. In their eyes, the men of Tuskegee had already been condemned to this role. Ending the study would waste decades of progress. Buxton's moral outrage collided with an institutional wall built on apathy and self-preservation. Frustrated but undeterred, Buxton continued to press the issue. In 1968, he formally filed a complaint within the Public Health Service, outlining the ethical violations of the study. Once again, his complaint was dismissed. The justification remained the same. The study was too important to abandon. Bureaucratic language masked a monstrous truth. Human lives were expendable in the name of data. By now, the study had been running for over 35 years. Entire generations had been infected. Children born with congenital syphilis, wives unknowingly exposed. Yet to the officials, the men were still subjects, not patients, and their suffering still just numbers on a chart. As the 1970s approached, the national atmosphere made it harder for such injustices to remain hidden. The civil rights movement had exposed the depth of systemic racism in America. The Vietnam War had eroded public trust in government institutions. Universities and activists were questioning authority more loudly than ever before. In this climate of skepticism, Buxton realized that internal complaints would never be enough. The truth had to reach the public. In 1972, he took a step that would change history. He leaked the details of the Tuskegee study to a reporter at the Associated Press. On July 25, 1972, the story broke. Syphilis victims in U.S. study went untreated for 40 years, the headline read. The article laid bare the full horror of the experiment. Hundreds of poor black men deliberately denied treatment for syphilis, their lives sacrificed for scientific curiosity. The revelations were shocking, not only because of the cruelty involved but because the study had continued for so long, under the oversight of government agencies, without public knowledge. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Newspapers across the country picked up the story, sparking outrage among readers. Civil rights leaders condemned the study as yet another example of how America devalued black lives. Communities already suspicious of the medical establishment now had proof of betrayal. The study's very existence confirmed their worst fears, that doctors could not be trusted, that government programs carried hidden dangers, and that promises of care might mask sinister motives. The exposure of Tuskegee came at a time when the nation was already grappling with deep mistrust in authority. The Pentagon Papers had recently revealed government deception in Vietnam, and the Watergate scandal was beginning to unravel. Against this backdrop, the Tuskegee revelations struck a raw nerve. If the government could lie about war and politics, why not medicine? If men could be left to die in Alabama, what else was being hidden? The study became a symbol of betrayal, a glaring example of how far institutions could go when shielded from accountability. In Congress, hearings were called to investigate. Families of the Tuskegee men stepped forward, their voices trembling with grief and anger. Wives describe how they, too, had been infected, how children had been born sick. Sons spoke of fathers who had wasted away, never knowing the truth. The human toll, laid bare in testimony, pierced through the sterile language of science and forced the nation to confront the reality of what had been done. These were not faceless subjects. They were men with families, whose suffering had been calculated and prolonged by those in power. The whistleblowing of Peter Buxton stands as a turning point in the story. Without his persistence, the Tuskegee study might have continued even longer, hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and silence. His actions highlight the critical role of conscience in the face of institutional wrongdoing. Yet his struggle to be heard also underscores how resistant systems can be to self-correction. For 6 years, his protests were ignored. It took the power of the press, the court of public opinion, and the rising tide of social justice movements to finally bring the truth into the light. The 1972 exposé marked the beginning of the end for the Tuskegee study, but it was also the beginning of a new era of mistrust. Communities that had long suspected injustice in medicine now had irrefutable proof. The betrayal of Tuskegee would cast a shadow over public health for generations, shaping how medical research was perceived, particularly among African Americans. The cracks that began with one whistleblower became a flood that swept away decades of secrecy, but the damage done was irreversible. In the unraveling of the Tuskegee study, we see the power of truth to break silence, but also the cost of how long that truth was suppressed. The 1960s and 1970s exposed not only the horrors of the experiment but the fragility of trust between citizens and their government. By the time the study ended, The voices that had once been whispers had become a national outcry. But for the men of Tuskegee and their families, the revelation came too late. Their lives had already been consumed by lies, their futures stolen in the name of science. The cracks in the silence eventually destroyed the Tuskegee study, but they also left behind a scar that would never heal. The whistleblower, the journalists, the families who spoke out, all played their part in revealing the truth. Yet the question that lingers is haunting. How many lives could have been saved if those cracks had opened sooner? The Associated Press story of July 25, 1972, detonated like a bomb. For 40 years, the Tuskegee syphilis study had operated in secrecy, shielded by bureaucratic indifference and the complicity of the medical establishment. But now, the silence was broken, and the public was confronted with the unthinkable. Their government had knowingly allowed hundreds of men to suffer and die from a curable disease, all in the name of science. The national outrage that followed was immediate, visceral, and unstoppable. It was not just the story of untreated syphilis, it was the story of deception, betrayal, and the systemic devaluation of black lives in America. Headlines across the country captured the horror. Newspapers ran scathing editorials condemning the Public Health Service and demanding accountability. Radio broadcasts relayed the shocking details into homes across America. Television news programs showed the faces of the survivors and their families, juxtaposed with cold government statements that tried, and failed, to justify the study. For many Americans, it was their first direct encounter with the depth of institutional racism in medicine, and the revelations were sickening. The outrage was magnified by timing. In 1972, the United States was already engulfed in scandals that eroded trust in government. Watergate was unfolding, exposing corruption at the highest levels. The Vietnam War had left citizens cynical about official narratives. Against this backdrop, the Tuskegee revelation struck a deeper chord. Here was proof that the government was not only lying but willing to sacrifice its own citizens. To the African American community, the news confirmed long-held suspicions that the medical system could not be trusted. To white America, it was a shocking indictment of institutions they had assumed were guided by ethics and humanity. Congress wasted no time in launching hearings. Survivors of the study, some frail and ill, were brought forward to testify. Their words cut through the clinical jargon that had dominated discussions of Tuskegee for decades. They spoke of doctors they trusted, treatments they thought they were receiving, and the devastation of discovering it had all been a lie. Wives and children testified too, describing how they had contracted syphilis from their husbands, how their families had been destroyed by illness and poverty. The hearings painted a picture of not just individual suffering but generational trauma, a wound passed down from father to son, mother to child. Lawmakers, confronted with undeniable evidence of abuse, demanded answers from the Public Health Service and the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. Officials scrambled to defend themselves, claiming that the study had once been justified by the standards of the 1930s, and that ending it earlier would have undermined scientific data. These excuses rang hollow. The presence of penicillin since the 1940s, the intentional withholding of treatment, and the deception of participants all proved that the study was not merely outdated but deliberately cruel. The hearings revealed a chilling truth. The experiment had continued not because of ignorance, but because of indifference. Civil rights leaders seized on the revelations as further evidence of systemic racism in America. Organizations like the NAACP and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference denounced the study, demanding justice for the victims and reforms to prevent such abuses from ever happening again. Black newspapers, such as the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier, ran searing commentary, connecting Tuskegee to the broader legacy of slavery, segregation, and exploitation. In churches across the South, pastors preached about betrayal and demanded that the government repent. The outrage was not just about Tuskegee, it was about centuries of broken promises to black Americans. The families of Tuskegee did not remain silent. In 1973, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of the survivors, their wives, and children. The case, Pollard versus United States, sought $1.8 billion in damages, citing negligence, deceit, and violation of constitutional rights. The government, eager to stem the public relations disaster, settled the case in 1974 for $10 million. Survivors received lifetime medical benefits, as did their wives and children who had been infected. But no amount of money could erase decades of suffering, nor could it restore the trust that had been shattered. The legal settlement did not absolve the government of responsibility. It deepened the conversation about accountability. Many demanded criminal charges against those who had designed and perpetuated the study, but none were ever filed. Not a single researcher or official faced prosecution. For the families, this lack of justice was a bitter reminder of the imbalance of power. They had been deceived for 40 years, and now, even as the truth came out, those responsible walked away unpunished. The fallout extended far beyond the courtroom. Medical institutions across the country were forced to confront their role in allowing the study to continue. Universities that had published research based on Tuskegee data faced scrutiny. The entire field of medical research was shaken by questions about ethics and oversight. Out of this reckoning came the creation of new safeguards, the National Research Act of 1974, which mandated the establishment of institutional review boards, IRBs, to oversee research involving human subjects. These reforms were designed to ensure that no experiment could be conducted without informed consent, transparency, and accountability. Yet while reforms addressed the structure of research, they could not mend the human damage. In African American communities, the Tuskegee study became a symbol of betrayal, a story passed down through generations as proof that the medical establishment could not be trusted. This legacy contributed to widespread suspicion of doctors, hospitals, and government health programs. Decades later, during the AIDS crisis of the 1980s and even the COVID-19 pandemic, public health officials found themselves battling not just disease but the ghost of Tuskegee, a lingering mistrust born of lies. For survivors, the national outrage was both vindication and torment. They had always trusted the doctors, believed the promises, endured the pain. Now, the world finally knew the truth. But for many, the recognition came too late. They were already dying from complications of untreated syphilis, their families already scarred by the disease. The anger of the nation could not reverse their fate. Their stories became part of a larger narrative, not just of medical malpractice, but of systemic racism and the dangers of unchecked authority. The national outrage over Tuskegee reshaped America's understanding of ethics, race, and trust. It showed that the line between healer and deceiver could be crossed with shocking ease, and that institutions could betray the very people they were sworn to serve. It forced Americans to confront uncomfortable truths, that racism was not confined to the South or to politics, but had infected even the most respected halls of science and medicine. By the time the hearings ended and the settlement was reached, the Tuskegee study had become more than an experiment. It was a symbol of betrayal, of exploitation, and of the fragile nature of trust. The national outrage was not just about what had been done, but about what it revealed, that in the pursuit of knowledge, humanity itself had been abandoned. The Tuskegee syphilis study cannot be understood solely through the lens of science or politics. At its core, it is a story of human beings whose lives were torn apart by deception. Behind every chart, every medical report, every coldly written paper in a scientific journal stood a man whose body was slowly unraveling, a wife whose health was stolen, a child born with a disease that should never have been theirs. The human toll of Tuskegee was not confined to the men enrolled in the study. It radiated outward like ripples in a poisoned pond, infecting families, crippling communities, and leaving scars that would endure for generations. For the men themselves, the suffering was intimate and relentless. They endured the ravages of untreated syphilis, painful ulcers, deteriorating bones, blindness, paralysis, and the cruel descent into neurosyphilis, which robbed them of memory and reason. Some lost their ability to work, leaving their families without income. Others became withdrawn and unrecognizable to their loved ones as dementia and psychosis set in. These men were not nameless test subjects. They were farmers, laborious, husbands, fathers. Each decline marked not only a personal tragedy but the collapse of entire households dependent on them for survival. The wives of Tuskegee bore a different kind of torment. Unknowingly infected by their husbands, they carried the disease into their own bodies, suffering miscarriages, stillbirths, and the agony of syphilitic complications. Some endured years of deteriorating health, never understanding why their conditions worsened despite the assurances of doctors. For them, the betrayal cut even deeper. They had trusted their husbands' words when they said the doctors were helping. They had trusted the white-coated men who handed them bottles of tonics and tablets. In reality, their marriages had become conduits for a disease that was deliberately left unchecked. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of Tuskegee rests with the children. Congenital syphilis, passed from mother to child, resulted in infants born blind, with deformities, or suffering from seizures and developmental delays. Some children died in infancy. Others grew up carrying the weight of a disease that could have been prevented with a simple injection of penicillin. Generations were marked not just by grief but by physical reminders of the study's cruelty. These children never agreed to be part of any experiment, yet they were bound to its consequences from the moment of birth. The trauma extended beyond the physical. Psychological wounds festered in families who discovered, often too late, that their loved ones had been betrayed. Imagine the devastation of a son who learns that his father's illness was not natural misfortune, but the result of government deception. Imagine the anger of a wife who realizes that her suffering, and the suffering of her children, was caused not by fate but by the deliberate withholding of treatment. The weight of this revelation was crushing, leaving many families in disbelief, rage, and despair. For them, the Tuskegee study was not an abstract scandal, it was a personal nightmare. Communities in Macon County carried the collective burden. As men grew sicker and families weakened, poverty deepened. Farms went untended, children dropped out of school to help support households, and medical mistrust grew like a poison in the soil. Even after the study was exposed, its legacy continued to fracture relationships between black communities and the medical system. Rumors spread, stories were passed down, and the memory of betrayal became ingrained in the culture. The Tuskegee study was not just an experiment on individuals, it was an assault on an entire community's trust and stability. Oral histories reveal the quiet resilience of survivors, but also their deep pain. Some men expressed shame, feeling they had been duped, made fools of by doctors who wore the mask of authority. Others simply could not comprehend why the government would do such a thing. Their confusion was perhaps the cruelest part of all. Even when the truth came out, the betrayal was too vast, too senseless to fully grasp. For many survivors, their final years were spent wrestling not only with illness but with the unbearable knowledge that they had been lied to for decades. The numbers themselves tell a grim story. Out of the 399 men with syphilis, countless died prematurely from complications of the disease. Dozens of wives were infected. At least 19 children were born with congenital syphilis, though researchers suspect the number may have been higher. Behind each statistic was a face, a name, a family forever changed. The toll cannot be measured only in lives lost but in the potential future stolen, the crops never harvested, the children never educated, the dreams never realized because disease and deception had consumed them. Even after the study was revealed, the damage could not be undone. Penicillin was finally offered to surviving participants, but for many, it was too late. The disease had advanced beyond cure, leaving only suffering to be managed. Lawsuits brought some financial compensation, but no settlement could restore what had been lost. Money could not bring back fathers who had died in confusion, wives who had wasted away, or children who had suffered needlessly. The payments, though significant on paper, felt hollow compared to the generations of agony that had been inflicted. The human toll of Tuskegee extends even further, into the realm of collective memory. Within African American communities, the story of Tuskegee became a warning, passed from elders to youth. Do not trust the doctors, do not trust the government, do not believe the promises of those in power. This mistrust continues to shape decisions about healthcare today, influencing attitudes toward vaccinations, clinical trials, and medical research. The shadow of Tuskegee lingers, not as a distant history, but as a living wound carried across generations. In examining the toll, one truth becomes inescapable. The men of Tuskegee were robbed not only of their health but of their agency. They were denied the dignity of choice. Had they been told the truth, some might still have chosen to participate, understanding the risks. But they were never given that chance. Instead, their bodies became canvases on which doctors painted their theories, their lives reduced to experiments in suffering. Their families became collateral damage in a project that valued data over humanity. The tragedy of Tuskegee is not just that men died from syphilis. It is that they died believing they were being helped, while in reality they were being watched, measured, and catalogued like specimens. Their wives wept, their children struggled, their communities bore the weight, and still the doctors kept silent. The human toll was not just physical or psychological, it was existential. It struck at the very meaning of trust, of care, of what it means to be human in the hands of another. The story of Tuskegee's victims is a story of broken lives and broken trust. It is a reminder that behind every historical atrocity are ordinary people, living ordinary lives, whose humanity was stolen. And it is a warning that when systems of power treat people as expendable, the cost is never contained to numbers in a file. It is etched in the bodies, the minds, and the souls of those who suffer. Tuskegee's toll was measured in blood, in tears, and in generations forever marked by the cruelty of deception. By the mid-1990s, the Tuskegee syphilis study had already become a stain on the conscience of America, a wound that no lawsuit or settlement could truly heal. Survivors and their families carried scars, some visible, others buried deep in memory. Decades had passed since the Associated Press expose ended the experiment in 1972, yet the United States government had never offered a formal apology. For many, this silence was salt in the wound. It was as if the suffering of the men of Tuskegee, and the devastation inflicted upon their families, was acknowledged only in clinical reports and courtroom settlements, never in the moral language of justice. That would finally change in 1997, when the highest office in the land publicly admitted what had been done and asked for forgiveness. President Bill Clinton, standing in the White House before a group of survivors and their descendants, delivered words that history had long demanded. He acknowledged that the Tuskegee study was wrong, not just misguided, not just outdated, but morally indefensible. What was done cannot be undone, he said, but we can end the silence. We can stop turning our heads away. We can look at you in the eye, and finally say, on behalf of the American people, what the United States government did was shameful, and I am sorry. For the men seated before him, frail, elderly survivors who had endured the slow cruelty of untreated syphilis, the apology was a moment of recognition, decades overdue. The ceremony was more than symbolic. It was a national reckoning. Survivors who had once been treated as data points were now treated as witnesses, their pain honored in front of the world. Their families, too, were acknowledged. Wives who had been infected, children born with congenital syphilis, generations who had carried the burden of betrayal. Clinton's words did not erase the injustice, but they gave it a voice, placing the government's guilt squarely in the public record. For the first time, the men of Tuskegee were not subjects of an experiment. They were victims of injustice recognized by their nation. But even as the apology rang across television screens, questions lingered. Could words heal wounds that had been festering for over 60 years? Could an apology restore trust in communities where faith in medicine had been shattered? Many survivors and descendants appreciated the gesture, but they also recognized its limitations. An apology did not cure the disease. It did not bring back the dead. It did not erase the years of suffering endured in silence while the world looked away. To some, it felt like the government was trying to close the chapter too easily, as if an admission of guilt was the final act, when in truth, it was only the beginning of accountability. The 1997 apology also forced the country to confront its broader history. Tuskegee was not an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. From forced sterilizations of black, indigenous, and poor women, to radiation experiments on unsuspecting patients, to the legacy of medical segregation, America's history of unethical medical practices ran deep. Clinton's apology was not only about Tuskegee, it was about acknowledging a larger betrayal, one that shaped how marginalized communities viewed healthcare and government institutions. The apology became a marker in history, a line drawn between silence and recognition, but also a reminder of how far the nation still had to go. The survivors themselves received the apology with a mixture of gratitude and quiet grief. By 1997, only a handful of the original participants were still alive, their bodies frail but their memories sharp. They had lived long enough to hear their government admit to its crimes, but they had also lived long enough to know that justice delayed is justice denied. Some wept. Others sat stoically, their expressions unreadable. What they had endured could never be undone by words, yet the acknowledgement carried a weight that generations had been waiting to hear. For their families, it was a moment of validation, that the pain passed down through stories and scars was not imagined, not exaggerated, but real and recognized. The apology also highlighted the inadequacy of reparations. The 1974 settlement had provided $10 million in financial compensation, along with medical care for survivors and their infected families. Yet many argued that this was not enough to match the scale of suffering. Lives had been shortened, futures destroyed, trust permanently damaged. Money could not measure such loss. Some descendants felt the government owed more: scholarships, community investment, greater efforts to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. Clinton's words acknowledged guilt, but they did not answer the question of whether justice had truly been served. Perhaps the most enduring impact of the apology was its symbolic power. By publicly recognizing the wrong, the government created a framework for future conversations about ethics in medicine. The Belmont Report of 1979 and the establishment of institutional review boards had already laid out protections for human subjects in research, but Clinton's words gave those protections a moral foundation. They reminded the nation that behind every clinical trial, every medical advancement, are human lives that deserve dignity and informed consent. The apology was not just about the past, it was a call to vigilance for the future. Still, Mistrust endured. In many African American communities, Tuskegee became shorthand for betrayal. The government's apology, though historic, could not erase decades of suspicion. Studies in the years after 1997 showed that African Americans were significantly less likely to participate in medical research, citing Tuskegee as a reason. Vaccination campaigns, clinical trials, and public health initiatives faced skepticism rooted in the memory of men who had been deceived. Clinton's words were heard, but they could not silence the ghosts of Tuskegee, which continued to whisper in the ears of generations who had learned to be wary of promises. The legacy of the apology is therefore complex. On one hand, it marked a turning point, a moment when the United States government officially admitted to one of the darkest chapters in its medical history. On the other, it underscored the reality that some wounds cannot be healed by words alone. The survivors, their families, and their descendants carried burdens too heavy for speeches to lift. What the apology did accomplish was to ensure that Tuskegee would never again be hidden. It forced the nation to remember, to teach, to confront. In the end, the 1997 apology was both a reckoning and a reminder. It reminded America that justice delayed is justice denied, that silence can be as destructive as action, and that healing requires more than acknowledgement, it requires change. The men of Tuskegee, many of whom never lived to hear the words, became symbols of a painful truth, that human beings, when stripped of dignity and choice, can be sacrificed on the altar of progress. Clinton's apology gave them back a measure of dignity, but it also left behind a haunting question. Can true justice ever be achieved when lives have already been lost, futures already stolen? The Tuskegee syphilis study did not end in 1972 with newspaper headlines, or even in 1997 with a presidential apology. Its true ending is ongoing, written in the safeguards, the mistrust, and the uneasy lessons that continue to shape medicine today. If Tuskegee revealed anything, it is this: science without ethics becomes dangerous, and progress without humanity becomes betrayal. The study was not only a failure of compassion but also a failure of systems meant to protect the vulnerable. Out of its ashes came reforms that changed how medical research is conducted in the United States, but the shadow it cast has never fully lifted. In the wake of national outrage, one of the most immediate consequences was the creation of the National Research Act of 1974, which mandated the establishment of institutional review boards, or IRBs. These boards became the guardians of ethical research, charged with ensuring that no study involving human beings could move forward without careful review. Their role was to examine proposals, question methods, and most importantly, ensure that subjects gave informed consent. No longer could patients be deceived with vague terms like bad blood. Consent had to be explicit, documented, and voluntary. This was a direct response to the deception at Tuskegee, an attempt to guarantee that no participant would ever again be misled into sacrificing their health without knowledge. The Belmont Report, published in 1979, further defined the ethical principles that would guide research: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Respect meant that individuals must be treated as autonomous agents, with full understanding of what they agreed to. Beneficence meant that research had to maximize benefits while minimizing harm. Justice meant that the burdens and benefits of research had to be fairly distributed, ensuring that marginalized communities were not singled out for exploitation. These principles were, in many ways, an indictment of Tuskegee, which violated each one with brutal clarity. Yet while reforms built safeguards into the structure of research, they could not erase the scars of history. The mistrust seeded in Macon County spread across the nation, especially within African American communities. For many, Tuskegee became the ultimate cautionary tale, proof that the government, the medical establishment, and science itself could not be trusted. This mistrust continues to echo through time. During the AIDS crisis, many African Americans questioned whether the virus itself was the product of government experimentation. During vaccination campaigns, skepticism often traced back to what they did at Tuskegee. Even during the COVID-19 pandemic, references to the study resurfaced as communities weighed the risks of trusting public health officials. The lessons of Tuskegee were not just about ethics, they were about perception, about how once trust is broken, it may never be fully restored. For medical professionals, Tuskegee became a warning etched into training and education. Students in medical and public health programs are taught about it not simply as history, but as a moral compass. The case is dissected in ethics courses, presented as the example of what happens when ambition eclipses humanity. It is invoked to remind future doctors and researchers that the pursuit of knowledge must never come at the expense of dignity and life. The study's lessons are grim, but necessary, forcing each new generation of scientists to grapple with the darker chapters of their field. At the same time, Tuskegee remains a reminder of how easily systems can fail. Institutional safeguards can only function if people within them are willing to listen, to speak up, to act when something is wrong. The study endured for 40 years not because no one saw the problem, but because those who did were silenced or ignored. The lesson, then, is not only about creating structures like IRBs, but about fostering cultures of accountability where dissent